Hello and welcome to another episode of the Disgusting Resilient podcast. And on today's episode, we're going to be looking at top 5 Death Guard combos for beginners. These are going to be some of the most easiest, simplest combos that you can figure out and start playing in your own games to achieve instant results. Let's get into it. So the first combo we're going to be looking at, and probably one of the most well known, is the Plague Bombardment combo. This is basically where we're going to use the core units of Mortarion, Plague Burst Crawlers, and Lord of Virulence, which are going to supercharge our ability to fire indirect fire at our opponents from across the map and remove units before they even get to shoot shots back at us. So, how's this going to work then? So basically, we're going to need all the components here. So we have the Plague Burst Crawlers themselves are going to be our indirect fire. So indirect obviously lets you shoot out of line of sight, means you can target units no matter where they are on the board and fire at them all the time. The normal downside to this is that they'll be hitting on 4s. However, with this combination, we're actually going to supercharge that up. So, first things first, Mortarion has an aura called Lord of the Death Guard. This allows you to ignore all modifiers to your characteristics when you're firing your models. This means that the penalty that you normally get for firing indirect, which will give you -1 to your hit rolls, can be ignored completely. And this is also going to ignore any additional defenses that your opponents have. They can't pop smoke to -1 hit, you can ignore that. -1 to wound, ignore that. -1 damage, ignore that. Armor of Contempt, anything like that, you ignore all of it, okay? So now, our Plague Burst Crawls have gone from hitting on 4s with the indirect mortars to hitting on back to 3s because we ignore the -1. So that's good. But let's supercharge it even more. Now we're going to bring along a Lord of Virulence. Usually you want this guy teleporting in with some Death Shroud Terminators, but the Lord of Virulence has an ability that any target that he can see, doesn't have to be any range, just as long as he can see them, all your blast weapons, which surprisingly the Plague Burst Mortars are going to get +1 to hit and ignore cover. So what this means now is that the Plague Burst Crawlers have gone from hitting on 4s without any of this to now hitting on 3s because of Mortarion, and if the Lord of Virulence can see it, you're now hitting on 2s. So out of line of sight, you're hitting targets on a 2+ to hit, and not only that, you're going to ignore the benefits of cover, so that AP1 is going to start kicking in. Now this can further be enhanced by having units that can sort of play up the board a bit faster. You're looking at bloat drones, cultists, stuff like that, rhinos, and you're going to take the Rattle Joint Agu, I don't know how you say it, and this is the contagion rule that reduces enemy saves by 1. So this means if you manage to get an enemy unit within contagion range of one of your units, your indirect is now going to be hitting out of line of sight on 2s to hit, wounding most infantry on 2s or 3s, and with Mortarion around, Mortarion also can pick the reroll 1s to wound aura from his data slate. So now you're wounding them on 2s or 3s, rerolling 1s, and that's going to add up at AP2 because again the -1 save plus the naturally AP1, ignoring cover because of the Lord of Virulence. So you can drop out 3d6 plus 9 plus any blast bonuses, shots onto targets, hitting on 2s out of line of sight, wounding on 2s and 3s, rerolling 1s at AP2, ignoring cover. And honestly, this thing picks stuff up. Light vehicles get picked up, infantry gets picked up. This can mull up most things in the game. And if your Lord of Virulence can't get to a line of sight on a target, you can always back up to the Boilbrute stratagem, which basically gives the same effect, giving you Plague Burst Crawlers +1 to hit if they stay still, and ignores cover. So there's another sort of backup there to help the combo work if the Lord of Virulence can't get line of sight. So, what's this good for? Firstly, this is great for people that have preference to a defensive playstyle. This ability to pick up and interact with your opponent's army without having to expose too many units is great if you're someone like myself that prefers the passive defensive playstyle. What this also allows you to do is remove key assets from your opponent's army. So if your opponent has, let's say, one really scary anti-tank unit and it's like Devastators with 5 las cannons or something, you can pick this up without ever exposing your tanks and Mortarion, and once that unit is dead, you're now basically free to run rampant with all your vehicles. Another great thing for this, it forces your opponent to be the aggressor. If you're passive, you're happy when your opponent is trying to push into you and you counter-attack. So by being shot by mortars every turn, hitting on 2s, again, AP2, ignore cover, all that stuff, your opponent can't just sit back and let this happen for 5 turns, because 5 turns of this, they're not going to have much army left. So what this means is your opponent has to make things happen, which means they're going to make mistakes, which you can then punish as a defensive player. Another pro. So Mortarion, again, ignoring all modifiers is fantastic. It's not just ignoring the indirect penalty, which is the main thing for this combo, but it also means anything like -1 damage gets ignored, -1 AP, all these kind of things can be absolutely ignored by Mortarion. This means that the opponent's most defensive, secure units are actually now suddenly quite vulnerable. Anything that has -1 damage, like Terminators, some Terminators have -1 damage, that can make them quite annoying to kill. Suddenly now, you're ignoring that completely, which is basically 100% damage gain on that unit. Another great thing to tie into the first point is when the opponent tries to push you and tries to charge at your forces because you're making them have to make something happen because of all the mortars that are firing over, you have a fantastic counter charge threat in Mortarion. The opponent comes towards you to try and stop the indirect. Mortarion's waiting there because he's supporting his Plagueverse crawlers, and then Mortarion has the ability to charge whatever's trying to pressure you, which means Mortarion is now getting value, which is fantastic. Another pro for this is it really doesn't need mobility. You can shoot anything anywhere. That is the power of indirect. So slow and steady Death Guard being, Eldara dancing behind buildings, the Fire and Fade, the Phantasm, you don't give a shit. You just keep firing those mortars and picking up those units. And especially against MSU, which stands for multiple small units, or minimum size units, against armies that have lots of 5-man squads, this is absolutely brutal because every mortar that connects and collaterals in, potentially killing 3-odd models, they're losing units every turn. If you manage to get hitting on 2s with the AP2, you could pick up an entire unit with 1 Plagueburst Crawler alone, which is crazy. And these units will start getting dwindled down. They suddenly can't play the game much anymore. The output's reduced drastically. And now you have a solid upper hand from the safety of indirect. Now, there are some things to note with this, however. It is expensive combo. Almost half your list goes points into the combo, but that doesn't mean it's just for the indirect. Do remember that Mortarion and the Plagueburst Crawlers have amazing defensive profiles. So the idea is that you weaken the opponent and then push forward aggressively with these units because you have removed the key assets that were going to threaten your tanks and Mortarion. And at this point, once you've removed them, they are free to run rampant over the game. It does, however, mean you're going to have less frontline units at the start of the game. You need to really pace this out and know when you've inflicted enough damage to start being aggressive, okay? And this goes true for Mortarion. Sometimes you can feel like you're a ball and chain around your feet tied to Mortarion because you have to follow him around to keep the aura. So you need to learn, and this is one thing you get from playing, when it's right to leave Mortarion's aura, accept the weaker indirect, but also be able to do stuff like, score certain objectives, split up across the map because you've done enough damage now. You need to know when to make that aggressive push. And one more thing, this isn't as effective against vehicle spam lists. Obviously the mortars being strength 8. Lethal hits helps. Strength 8, AP2, damage 2, AP2 with the contagion obviously. It's decent and you can kill some vehicles, but if you're against a list that's brought like 11 tanks, you're going to struggle to get through them at a relative speed. So if you're in a really, really crazy tank meta, probably not the right build. But if you're in a meta with a balanced list or lots of infantry, especially MSU builds, this combo is going to absolutely wreak havoc. And it's one of my personal favourites for the start of the edition, and I still like bringing it out every so often because it's just kind of funny. Anyway, on to the next one. Okay, the Plague Bus. The Plague Bus is currently my favourite thing to use in the game. Basically, what the Plague Bus is, it is a Chaos Rhino loaded up with 2 squads of 5 Plague Marines and 2 Malignant Plaguecasters. These can either be attached to the squads or not attached to the squads, depending. Now, some people swap this out for Foul Blight Spawns instead, but I found the Plaguecasters to be better. And basically what this does, it turns our humble little Rhino into a Land Raider Redeemer. It has horrific damage output and can really take people by surprise and becomes a little gunboat as well as a transport. It's super versatile and I absolutely love it. Let's get into how it works. So, it's utility transport. You have the ability to carry 10 Plague Marines, which is 20 OC. This is fantastic and we keep them in smaller squads because sometimes we only need to get 1 squad out. Whether this is to, drive forward 12, hop out 3, flip an objective. Drive forward 12, hop out 3, cleanse the secondary, deploy teleport homers. All sorts of things that the utility of this transport brings. You can move forward 12, get out, grenade strat and then shoot the Plague Marines. But the real magic of this is the firing deck 2 that the Rhino brings. This is going to be used by our Plague Casters. Each Plague Caster has a D6 plus 3 shot torrent weapon, so it automatically hits at strength 6, AP 2 and D3 damage. Now, we play Death Guard, we can boost that AP with our contagions to AP 3, and you can also use Ferric Blight on the Rhino, which will boost the firing deck to make these all AP 4. So now you have 2d6 plus 6 automatic hitting shots at strength 6, potentially AP 4, D3 damage per shot. You're shooting at Marines, you're automatically hitting, wounding on 2s, each single one of them doesn't just ignore saves completely because it's AP 4 against a Marine, which is a free up save, and each one's doing D3 damage. It is honestly incredible damage output and people really don't expect it. The greater thing is as well, because it's torrent, when you shoot at vehicles, anything that isn't T13, because you'll be near them, will drop down to T11 at T12, is actually wounded in 5s and 6s, which sounds kind of rubbish, but you remember, because you're not rolling to hit, in a way you can look at this as having lethal 5s and 6s to hit, because there is no hit roll, so the wound roll is kind of like the hit roll. And 5s and 6s can actually be quite spiky, especially with this many shots. And each one of them being AP 4 potentially and D3 damage, the ceiling for this ability to just wipe something out is unreal. And I've had multiple people in our Discord trying out this build and being like, holy crap, I just killed a Forge Fiend. Holy crap, I just killed, you know, a Predator. Like, this thing can slap so damn hard. But that's not everything. The Playcasters also have 2 utility abilities. Now, you will have to get out the Rhino to use these, but in melee matchups, they're fantastic. You not only have a -1 to wound on to opponents, like debuffs them, makes them worse in close combat, which is great. You can also, anyone you hit with the Flamer attack is -2 to move and charge. And this stacks because it's not putting a status effect on the unit. So if both Playcasters shoot the same unit, that unit is -4 to move and charge, which is hilarious when you put it on Custodes or something like that. Drop them to a 2-inch move and charging at -4. It's pretty grim. Now do remember, you can't use that ability from inside the firing deck, so you need to know when to get out to use this. But I've played many games where I've never made any use of these abilities because I'm against Tau shooting, and the Flamers alone have made their value back tenfold. Not to mention, we're still packing 10 Marines in here. This is 10 OC per 5-man, so these are great for jumping out of the Rhino, just taking an objective, shooting a melter gun, maybe just throwing a grenade stratagem, all the while the actual Rhino's still doing the threat. And the great thing is, because the Plague Marines are the OC and the Rhino isn't, if an opponent reacts, their initial reaction is to kill the Plague Marines because they don't want to hold the objective, which usually means the Rhino of Flame of Death and Doom is left alive for another turn, which will then drop another 5 guys out, drive off and flame something else to death. It's fantastic. I love this so much. It's so fun to play with as well. So the pros, it's super versatile. It's got good offense and objective play. You can even use it defensively. It's still a Rhino with 10 Plague Marines inside it. It can trade up super well. This thing surprises people so much by how much damage output it can do. It just drives up to something, people are like, ah, it's a Rhino, and then suddenly some of the most horrific flamers in the world come out of it. Especially if you spike high on the damage rolls and you roll a lot of free damage, you can just obliterate most things in the game. Now, one trick I like doing with this is using rapid ingress stratagem. No one expects a Rhino popping up in an area where it's fairly safe. You know, maybe it's backfield, maybe it's just gaining some distance. And then in your turn, you can then get out a squad that can move 8, charge something. The Rhino can drive off a different way, 12 inches, and flame a unit to death, and drop 5 more guys out on an objective. There is so many things this can do, and nobody expects the bus. Because again, people, when they think of rapid ingress, they're looking at your Death Shroud Terminators, looking at things that are going to drop in and move forward. So they'll screen it out. They'll be like, yeah, you got a 9-inch charge, I'll just make it like a 12 or something. But then suddenly a Rhino appears, and that 12-inch pre-measuring they've done is now you drive 12, you finish precisely 1 inch away from them, get out 5 Marines, shoot the shit out of them, throw a grenade strat, and the Flame of Blast cleans anything else out that's near it. It's so much fun. Try it out. I gotta recommend this one so much. I'm having so much fun with it. And it's full of tricks. Again, you've got all the debuffs that the casters can put out. Another trick that was brought to me at the Manchester GT is that the casters can start, if you're not against any indirect, the casters can deploy outside of the Rhino, because what this does is it gives you 2 dead drops in deployment. So you want your opponent to deploy as much first as possible because it gives you information. So what you can do is you can go Rhino with the Marines inside and go 1 caster next to it, next drop, 1 caster next to it. So you've nullified 2 drops, and the only thing they're going to do first turn is hop in the Rhino and do what it was going to do anyway. So you've basically bought yourself 2 drops of information from your opponent, which I thought was fantastic and really innovative from the fella that taught me that, Manchester. I don't remember your name, I do apologise. I know you're in Discord and whatnot, but it was really cool, man, and really clever, so I appreciate it. And yeah, it's still a Rhino, and it's still got Plague Marines inside, which means you still have access to both Tank Shock and Grenade Stratagem. So if something lives on, 1 wound after the Playcaster boss, and you still want to do like a cleanse or something, chuck a grenade, or just go for the Tank Shock. There's still ways to deal mortals on top of the other absurd damage output you can do. Now, slight cons on this one, and slight notes. Just remember, this is giving up Assassinate and Bring It Down. There are 2 characters in here, potentially unattached, and the Rhino itself is a vehicle. I don't see this too much as an issue, because we already run 10-man squads of Plague Marines with like Biological Putrefires and Foul Blight Spawns, and they give up the same amount of points. It's what it is. The shooting matchups, the utility is somewhat worse, but as I have said, don't worry, because the damage output they provide, even in the matchups against Tower, etc., are still good, and technically slowing units down can still be good. Dropping broadsides to a 1-inch move because you've double tapped them with a minus to move is actually kind of funny. Means they're never getting an angle ever. And it's still decent, but the real magic is the output that it can do. And just remember though, unfortunately you can't Overwatch out of firing deck. Imagine if you could, that would have been great. But yeah, that's the Plague Bus. Recommend this one highly. Try it out. On to the next one. So this is the Plod Squad. The Plod Squad is the most bread and butter thing that Death Guard have at the moment. 9 out of 10 Death Guard players are going to be aware of the Plod Squad. But for those that aren't aware of it, this is the sort of bread and butter of your army. This is the core Plague Marine unit. So what it is, Chaos Rhino, a big squad of 10 Plague Marines, Biological Putrefire, and a Foul Blight Spawn. The 2 main optional loadouts for this one are full melee, with all the bubotic weapons and heavy plague weapons you can take, usually alongside like 1 or 2 flamers, and then the balanced build where you want spewers, choice of plasma or melter, heavy plague weapons, plasma on the sergeant, and a blight launcher. Both of these are viable, both of these have uses. But how does the Plod Squad work? Why is it so good? So, Rhinos in the Plod Squad usually want to find a staging point. This is a place on the terrain where they can sort of tuck in, stay, and be safe, but at the same time be threatening disembarking and charging anything such as objectives, key units, key avenues of movement. So if there's a certain lane, only big vehicles can move down, but if you come down it, I can now get out my Rhino and charge you. That's a good staging point. These Rhinos, depositing these big scary units of Plague Marines, will control the board massively. Now, the Biologist and the Blight Spawn are the 2 characters that make this combo as good as it is. The Biologist gives the unit not only a free grenade stratagem whenever they want it, but it also gives lethal hits to all their weapons. So Plasma Gun's lethal hits, Melter Gun's lethal hits. All the melee is already lethal hits anyway, but everything is literally lethal hits. Not only that, you will score a lethal hit on a 5 or a 6, which is crazy good. It means your Plasma Guns can just fire at the most random things like Land Raiders, and a 5 or a 6, you've just wounded them at like AP 4 potentially because of contagions, which is just going to add up in damage really quickly. Now, to combine with this, you can use the stratagem for sustained hits in melee, and this will also trigger on a 5+ from the Biological Putrefire. So on 5s to hit, you have not only sustained hits and lethal hits, which is really good. To make this even better, the Foul Blight Spawn brings along the Fights First rule for the unit. That means even if you get charged by the opponent, you will swing first. This means because of the output this unit can have with all the lethals and sustained, this unit is extremely unapproachable by melee armies and very hard for them to deal with, which is great, obviously, for taking defensive positions, but also being aggressive. It means you can charge in. Opponent may have set up a counter charge, but you now don't have to worry too much because you will fight first on that counter charge, which is great. The Biological Putrefire also brings along an incredible assault weapon. Not incredible because of the stats on it, but because assault weapons let you advance and do objectives. So later in the game, you might have 3 Plague Marines left in the characters. You get something like Deploy Teleport Homers. You realise you're 6 inches away from your enemy's deployment zone. So you're like, normally you'd be like, ah, I'm 1 inch off, I can't do anything. But with a biologist Putrefier there, you can advance and deploy teleport almost because he has an assault weapon. So it's really utility and gives you that extra versatility there. And the Marines, what do they bring to the combo? Well, Marines get a crazy amount of special weapons. Absurd. Like, no other basic troop unit in the game gets as good weapon loadouts as Plague Marines. You can have 5 Power Fists in the squad, 2 Melter Guns, 1 Plasma Gun, 2 Anti-Infantry Flamers, and a Blight Launcher. That is insane for, was it 180 points? It is pretty bonkers. And combined with the rules from the Biologist for the lethal hits on 5s and the fights first that the Foul Blightspawn brings, alongside the weapons that those two characters bring, the Foul Blightspawn with the Anti-Infantry 2 damage 2 Flamer, the Biologist with his damage 2 Blight Grenades, it's just extremely high output for the actual cost of the unit. Like, no other battle line unit in the game, I don't think, can fight Plague Marines and say they do better than Plague Marines as a battle line unit, which is fantastic. So, what makes it so good? Damage output. It's incredible. You can get up to AP 4, 5 melee and shooting with the right contagion. Plus, you can always use the stratagem Ferric Blight to increase it another one. The lethal 5s is the big thing. It just gets around toughness completely. Gets around any minuses to wound, etc. Because every 5 to hit, you just straight up wound. Which means that these things can shoot at any target and melee any target. Toughness 13 Night Valiant. Don't care. Charge it. Lethal 5s. Bye, mate. There's lots of things that this unit can take on and deal a substantial amount of damage for. They have fantastic combos with stratagems. If you have another Plague Marine squad, one of them can use a grenade, and then the Biologist Putrefier from another squad can use a free grenade, which means you can double grenade into a tough unit, which is an average 6 mortal wounds, which is great against stuff like Land Raiders, because you've dealt nearly half their health entirely in mortal wounds there. And obviously those grenade rolls can potentially spike. Maybe you do, instead of 6, maybe you do 8 or 9, which would be really cool. Again, Sanguinous Flux, sustain 5s in close combat. If you're on an infected objective marker, do remember that becomes sustain 2 on 5s, which then just gets absolutely bonkers and makes this unit with the fights first. Again, you sit on an infected objective, fights first, the opponent charges you, you fight first, pay 1 command point, sustained hits 2 on every 5 to hit, obliterates 90% of things in the game. It's great. And this unit's just super versatile. It can be aggressive, it can be defensive, it outtrades almost anything in the game when used right. The T5 really does actually come in a few times, often being the difference in wounding you on 2s and 3s, which is great. Sometimes this unit's just going to sit on an objective all game and hold it, knowing it's completely unapproachable by the opponent. Don't be tempted to try and take a charge or try and go deal damage. If this unit is holding a key point and is scoring you points every turn, keep it that way, okay? But it's what makes this unit so good. You usually see these things in multiples, normally be at least 2 Plod Squads in a competitive list, but it's because of these reasons. It's super versatile, tons of damage, great output, great utility, and on top of that, because it's battle line, it has the OC2, which is relatively important, especially when you start taking high OC. You actually notice how often you can actually bully the opponent off objectives. So it's just some things to note. They aren't unkillable. They are just toughness 5 free up save Marines. So if these guys get left in the open, they can die quite quickly. So you always want to try and get some value out of them before they get shot at. Or again, you expose more than one at a time to sort of give your opponent like priority nightmare of targets. So don't act like they're invincible, but they can shrug off a fair decent amount of whack, to be fair to them. Now loadouts, they do hit on force with the heavy plague weapons. This can be really, really whiffy sometimes. Sometimes you'll just really do a bad roll and only get a couple lethal hits. Normally evens out because of the amount of dice that you're going to roll. But just be aware, I usually find the actual shooting a bit more reliable than the melee, unless you've gone full melee squad, in which case then you just have a million melee weapons and it doesn't really matter, you're going to kill them anyway. But the balanced loadout, in my opinion, has the better utility at the cost of damage output. For example, you can, get out of a rhino, shoot a opposing rhino to death, blow it up, and then you can charge the contents that were inside. Whereas with the full melee squad, you don't have the ability to blow up the rhino in shooting, which means you charge the rhino, kill the rhino, they get out, charge you, and thankfully you have the fight first to save your ass there, which helps. But you've gone from killing 2 units in a turn to killing 1 unit in a turn. I'd rather kill both of them. But yeah, that's the Plod Squad. It's bread and butter. You're going to use it in most lists and you're going to see it absolutely everywhere. But it is a fantastic combination of units and rules to make a fantastic unit on the tabletop. So up next, the Boilbrute. The Boilbrute isn't the most competitive sometimes, but people have found successful with it. But what it is really effective when it does go off. So what it is basically just a Hellbrute, which sounds dumb. You're like, how's that a combo, Aiden? But don't worry, we'll get into it. Basically, what we're going to do with this Hellbrute is we're going to use him and we're going to mark an opponent's unit for death and then cause some chaos afterwards. So, how it works. I personally like to rapid ingress this fella, so I will bring him in from strategic reserves in my opponent's board, edge, something like that, where he can get a good angle on a target to shoot. Because what the Hellbrute does is when he shoots a unit, he can choose to have them be contaminated, which means you apply your contagion rules to them. So this is the -1 toughness and usually the -1 save at range, so up to like 48-inch range with las cannons. Now what this means is you can then play off this by making units much weaker to the others shooting in your army, particularly indirects from like Plague Burst crawlers, because you can also use the Boilblight stratagem as well. So effectively what you can do is you can shoot a unit, mark it for death, play Boilblight, mortars can then murder that thing, or any other shooting you've got in your army. It helps you apply your contagion effects at range, which is great. However, that's not the only thing you can do. This guy also has an incredible tank shot combo, hence why I like to rapid ingress him. So what he does is the Hellbrute naturally deals D3 mortal wounds on the charge. This can be used on top of the stratagem tank shock, which with his strength 12 power fist thing, which I'd always give him, the Hellbrute fist, you most of the time going to get 14 dice, because if you charge something that's T12, it goes to T11, means your strength is higher than their toughness, so you get the 2 extra dice on tank shock. So on average, you're going to get about 5 mortal wounds off this, potential to spike to the full 6. This means you have a potential top of doing 9 mortal wounds on the charge before even swinging once. This means you could like charge a Rhino. As long as something's done a little bit of damage to it, you charge the Rhino, potentially kill it with the mortal wounds. The guys get out of the Rhino, you can now pile into the squad and fight that squad. So remember, this all happens before you even swing with, I think it's 5 or 4 attacks, at like strength 12, AP 2 or 3 because of contagion, flat 3 damage each. So this guy can actually slap pretty hard. So the pros to it, it's a great force multiplayer. You can just bring one of these guys, fire away at a key unit, mark it for death, hit the Boilblight button, the rest of your army gets way better when shooting at that unit. He has his save reduced, he has his toughness reduced. Now you can get your entire army to get the heavy keyword and ignore cover versus it. Most things that are hit by a Hellbrute tend to die, which is great. The mortal output is also fantastic. You can combine this with stuff like grenades, tank shock himself, typhus mortal wounds. So for example, you have a really tough centerpiece model you need to kill. A typhus on average does 3 mortal wounds. A grenade can do an average of 3 mortal wounds, that's 6. Biological Putrefier can then do a free grenade, 9 mortal wounds. And this tank shot can then go in, which on average does about 7 mortal wounds. So we've just gone, what, 3, 6, 9 plus 7, 16 mortal wounds right there. And that's obviously with the potential to spike even higher. Most things are going to die if that connects, which is great. It's why I like to rapid ingress, bring it in from the side, shoot something, then move 6, charge onto another thing, tank shock that to death, and then punch whatever was left alive. It's great little 2-for-1 trading unit. This guy is fun. Maybe not always the most competitive, but incredibly fun, and when it works, it's great. He has a fairly small base, which means this guy is easier to ingress than most Terminator units, which take up more space. And if you ever bring him into your opponent's backfield because they've left a gap, absolute nightmare. This guy's running around with his 2-up save, decent toughness, tank shocking stuff, marking stuff for death that thought it was safe from indirect. It is really funny. Your opponent has to then divert resources back to deal with it. It probably will die, but at that point, if you've pulled stuff back, maybe got a cheeky tank shock, marked some up for death, that gives you a good advantage in the tempo of the game. So slight cons for him though, slight notes for him. Defensive can be somewhat lacking. I like to bring him in from reserves. Like I said, some people just run this guy with pure long-range firepower with las cannon missiles just to mark targets. They obviously don't get all the tank shock bonuses, hence why I like to bring the fist and do the reserves. The fist also has a combi bolter, which helps you get that all-important hit for the contagion application. But he's got a 2-up save, so you can't just kill him with any generic old thing. He will take some anti-tank firepower to kill. So you bring him in at the right point, can be a nightmare to deal with. He also draws a lot of attention. People really hate the Hellbrute. They just kind of want to shoot him, which can be good, because sometimes it means if you expose multiple units, expose the Hellbrute at the same time, and for some reason, 90% of opponents are going to shoot the Hellbrute rather than the Rhino full of Plague Marines that is barreling down upon them. And the last thing to be aware of is the Hellbrute is slow. It is a 6-inch move with vehicle restrictions, which isn't great, which I feel makes ingressing this guy mandatory to get the most value out of him. But as I've said, people like Don Houston and stuff have used this guy just with a heavy bolter to just plink something at range, mark it for death, mortars kill it, whatnot, all these other guns kill it, and then he doesn't really care if the Hellbrute dies at that point. I like to get a bit more value bringing it in from this ingress, but whichever way works, the guy can get value as long as he gets that shot off at least once. But yeah, that's the Hellbrute. It's very simple. It's not exactly a combo. It's more what he unlocks for your army and the little combos you can do with stratagems. Is it the most competitive? Probably not. But it's super fun, and if you pull it off, it's a great feeling, and the 9 mortal wounds when it does happen is just mwah, chef's kiss. And the last combo we're going to be looking at today is the Unkillashroud, as we're going to call it. So what this is it's Death Shroud Terminators supported by a Sorcerer in Terminator armor, sometimes Typhus. And all this is about is maximizing defensive stacking abilities to maximize the durability of this unit. So let's see how it works. So, as we said then, defensive stacking, we're going to maximize the amount of durability we can get. This is the one time when we're kind of looking at taking -1 weapon skill and ballistic skill contagion. The unique thing about this contagion is it can stack with -1 to hit rolls. This means if you've got the stratagem Cloud of Flies for -1 to be hit at range, this will put your opponent at literally -2 to hit. Not -1 and then ignoring any bonuses. No, it's actually, if you hit on 3s, you now hit on 5s. It's one of the most unique interactions in the game. One of the very few that actually does this, but that is how it works because it's a characteristic modifier and a hit roll modifier. They are 2 separate things. This also works with Nurglings who have an aura of 6 inches of infantry, non-vehicles, non-monsters, and -1 to hit in close combat. So this means you can also be -2 to hit in close combat. So Orcs with Power Claws who hit on 4s, now hitting you on 6s in close combat. Have fun with that one, guys. Now, Death Shroud themselves bring along even more defensive bonuses. They're -1 to wound if your opponent's strength is higher than your toughness. So anything, unless it's strength 12, is going to be wounding you on 4s. At strength 12, it's going to be wounding you on 3s. On top of that, you have a 2-up save, 4-up invulnerable, toughness 6, and 3 wounds per guy. So they're already quite tough anyway. What does the Terminator Sorcerer bring to this combo? The Terminator Sorcerer, in close combat, rolls a dice. On a 2-up, this squad is now -1 damage. And this can stack with the Disgustingly Resilient strat as well to make us -2 damage. So if anything comes in with flat 3 damage, you can, for a cost, drop it down to 1 damage. Most melee damage in the game is damage 2, so the Sorcerer alone, getting that 2-up off, not only saves you 2 command points every time, but literally cuts their damage in half straight away, which is fantastic. So, durability wise, you can be -2 to hit, -1 to wound, potentially in cover as well, so you're going to ignore 1 AP, and up to -2 damage melee only on that one, of course. What does this result in? A fantastic brawling unit. If you're against enemy melee units and you're in a meta with lots of melee, this unit can be a goddamn nightmare. It's -1 damage, potentially -2 damage. It's -2 to hit. It's -1 to wound. It's got a great save. It's got a great invuln, and they're fairly tough as well. Not to mention, these guys are also packing a great Overwatch with all the flamers, which again, melee units absolutely hate Overwatch, so really good deterrent there. And the Sorcerer brings a once per game casino gun, we're going to call it. So once per game, the Sorcerer can supercharge his ranged attack to make it strength 8, AP 2, flat 3 damage. It's 2d6 shots, it might whiff, you might roll the 12 and pick up an entire unit. It's a gimmick, but it's once per game, and that's the real value we're bringing in for mainly is that -1 damage to make this unit durable. But when you do bring them in, you do have quite a nasty ability to spike some damage there and pick up a unit. What this means is, in any brawling matchup against any heavy melee armies, you have this unit with the most stacked defensives that we can get. Now, if you don't have Nurglings, you can bring Typhus instead. Typhus is -1 to hit for his unit in close combat, so that unit is always going to be -2 to hit in close combat with the Contagion. Now you will lose access to the 2-up -1 damage because that's the Sorcerer, but do bear in mind we have a stratagem for that, but it will cost you 2 command points every time you want to do that. So it's sort of like, you know, swings and roundabouts. Typhus has the consistent -2 to hit, whereas the Sorcerer brings the -1 damage. But I prefer the Sorcerer because we can bring along Nurgling allies for the -1 to hit aura, which sort of works like Typhus. I mean, bring both. They're both great units. Bring Typhus and a Sorcerer in 2 different squads. But the Sorcerer has the ability to save you those 2 command points every turn. So if you're in a meta of Black Templars, World Eaters, all these kind of melee threats, Blood Angels, start looking at bringing some of these guys. Nasty Overwatch, great defenses, the ability to, again, -2 potential damage, really makes these guys a slog to get through. And then obviously when they swing back, Death Shroud do hit pretty hard. Strength 8, AP 2, 2 damage, hitting on 2s with 4 attacks each. Quite a nasty unit. So any cons for this unit? Speed, usually. Again, this is more a brawling unit. Make sure you always want a deep strike, and when you deep strike, you kind of deep strike around the location that you kind of want to stay in anyway. This means that once you drop in, you're probably going to stay in that rough general area. Obviously, this combo is weaker to shooting. You not only need to have other units to keep the enemy in contagion range to make the -2 to hit work, but obviously the -1 damage is melee only as well. But again, as I said, if you're in a melee meta, Orcs, World Eaters, Blood Angels, Black Templar, anything like that, you're going to have a great time bringing this unkillable big brick of Death Shroud with all the defensive stacking in the world, and people can really struggle to get through you. Sometimes just absorbing a charge and surviving is all you need to then counter a punch and knock out their key unit. But yeah, Unkillashroud, guys. Alright, so that wraps up my top 5 combos so far. And all I know now is, what are some of your favourite combos? And remember, everyone, keep experimenting. These are just my personal favourite combos. Doesn't mean they're the best in competitive technically, but they're great for beginners and people that just want a bit of a powerful unit on the board. There's a diverse range of viable units in these combos and in our army in general, so there's plenty more combos to find out. And again, always remember to find out what works for you personally as a player. What works for me might not work for you, and what works for you might not always work for me. But that's the fun of Warhammer, is to find out the kind of players we are and teach each other and learn each other all these cool little combos. And remember, guys, always engage with positivity. Always look for the people that are out there making the content and making the discussions, which are all about positivity and being positive on the army. Negativity has a place, don't get me wrong, saying this thing kind of sucks, but always trying to be on the brighter side of things and be like, okay, maybe this thing does suck, but what's the best we can get it to do? And you'll find weird little combos that can surprise people. But yeah, I really want you to let me know your comments, your favourite combos in the comments. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to our supporters of the YouTube memberships. Thank you to our sponsor, Salty Games. Thank you to Vanguard Tactics. So if you're after any Death Guard, especially discussingly resilient gaming aids, deep strike markers, etc., objective markers, check out Salty Games, the link below. If you're after learning a bit more how to play Warhammer a bit more competitively on the sportsmanship side too, check out Vanguard Tactics. Again, we have an affiliate link below. And if you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member. Massively appreciate all of our members. You get access to the Discord, giveaways, all that good stuff. But until then, thank you so much to all the people on the screen. Thank you to the members. Thank you to you, the viewer. And we'll catch you on the next episode. See you later, guys.